You're listening to episode 54 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Toni Bernhard joins us to speak about her newest book, How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness, a Mindful Guide. Do you suffer with chronic pain? I don't mean the occasional twinge in your shoulder from an old football injury, but an intense, unpleasant sensation that doesn't go away. Or perhaps your body just stopped working as you expect it should, to a debilitating degree. What would you do? If you're a listener to another podcast I'm lucky enough to host, you may already be familiar with today's guest. Toni Bernhard has been a long-time meditator, going on long meditation retreats and spending many hours rigorously practicing, but soon discovered that she simply could no longer engage in those difficult and taxing forms. She had to learn ways to make being sick the heart of her spiritual practice. And through truly learning how to be sick, she learned how, even with many physical and energetic limitations, to live a life of equanimity, compassion, and joy. She is the author of the award-winning How to Be Sick, a Buddhist-inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers, How to Wake Up, a Buddhist-inspired guide for navigating joy and sorrow, and the newly released How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness, a Mindful Guide. Our guest today is Toni Bernhard. Toni, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ted.
Just so glad to be speaking with you, and I'm honored you mentioned this is the first interview you're doing about your new book, your third book.
Yes.
And before we get started with that, I just want to briefly ask you to tell just a little bit of your story and how you came to write this particular book.
Well, the story of how I came to write this particular book, I think, starts with how I became much to my surprise, a writer in the first place. I was actually a professor on the campus at University of California, Davis, so this was more scholarly type writing. And in 2001, I got sick on a trip. I live in California. My husband and I had taken a trip to Paris, which was a big deal for us. And I got sick with what doctors thought was an acute viral infection, but I never recovered. And it's almost 14 and a half years later, and I still haven't recovered. It somehow compromised my immune system. And so I feel as if I call it the flu without the fever all the time. And as a result, I had to give up my career. I tried to go back to work part-time, and I couldn't do it. I was going from the bed to the job, back to the bed. And so I had to give up my career and wound up in my bedroom on my bed, which is where I am right now. And after several very difficult years of self-blame and confusion, even though I'd already been a Buddhist practitioner for 10 years, it feels as if I forgot everything that I learned. But I think of it now as I sometimes think, well, the Buddha was waiting in the wings, because about 2 or 3 years into this being basically housebound, I began to use the Buddhist practices that I learned to help me really learn how to be sick, learn how to live a fruitful and sometimes even joyous life despite my circumstances. And that, I started to write about it. And that led to my first book, How to Be Sick. And then I thought, well, that's that. I've written a book. My goodness. I've written a book and it got published. That's good enough. But then people started writing to me about all the problems and difficulties they were facing, way beyond, or not just having to do with illness. And that led to my second book, How to Wake Up, which presents my understanding of the Buddha's path to peace. It's a Buddhist book, and maybe think of it as an introduction in a way to Buddhism, because it covers all the basic things. And I thought, well, okay, now I'm done. I've written about illness. I've written about Buddhism. But one of the things that happened was, after How to Be Sick, was that I started getting emails from people all over the world who'd read the book and were writing to me about what they'd been facing with chronic pain and illness. And I realized that I was learning from them and that I had more to say. And so that is why I've written this third book, How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness, because it's much broader in scope than How to Be Sick. How to Be Sick is organized around practices that are helpful, whereas the new book is organized around all of the challenges that people with chronic pain and illness face. And some of those are challenges that I didn't personally face, like being young and living with chronic pain, for example. So the book just is a comprehensive look at what life is like with chronic pain and illness. And now I feel I've said everything I have to say.
We'll be talking again soon.
And I'm done. So that's what this third book is. And it's longer than the others because it's more comprehensive.
Yeah, something I want to share with the listeners is that Toni and I have spoken a couple of times before on a different podcast on those first two books, and we're bringing this new book, How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness, to present moment because of the change in nature. This is not a Buddhist book, and although there's some references there, this is really about how to be if you're suffering from chronic pain and illness. And Toni, one of the things that I wanted to share with you, and first my thanks to Wisdom Publications for getting me a proof copy of the book, is that as a writer, I have seen your maturity and your clarity and your voice strengthen and mature over time. And I think by far this is just a whole new level of versatility with writing that you've put together in this. It's just beautifully done, beautifully done. And what I'd like to do is just take a brief look at some of the topics that you have in here. And if you could just talk for a little bit about some of them. One of the ones you mentioned that stood out to me, you'd just spoken about, was that difference of when you're young and you have this, that's not necessarily something that's been part of your life. But I noticed you do have a section in here that's talking about when you're younger and you're ill. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the prompting to write that section and how that might be a little bit different than some of the other chapters in the book.
Well, it's different because to a large extent it's not written from my personal experience, although I always manage to find something in my life that relates to the topic at hand. I wrote this chapter because of all the young people that wrote to me and the parents of young people who wrote to me about the difficulties they face that I wasn't aware of. Even something as horrifyingly simple as a young person being challenged if they don't give up their seat on the bus to an older person, even though they're not able to stand up themselves. And if they try to explain that, having people treat them badly and not believe them. And so one of the difficulties they face, even from the medical community, is that people associate the word chronic with being older, middle-aged or older, certainly. And so they're told that they can't possibly have a chronic condition. But I've had people in their 20s write to me about having lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, and some of them, by the time they're 30 years old, have conditions I don't even know, had never heard of before, and they've had surgery after surgery to try to correct certain, difficulties with breathing or that kind of thing, or digestion, and they face a culture that simply doesn't believe that they're chronically ill or that they're in pain all the time. And so that's the first obstacle they face, is a culture that disregards them. And sometimes what's so sad about this is that it gets them to question themselves sometimes. And that's really counterproductive. And so I urge them to trust their bodies and to be compassionate toward themselves. And there are many other obstacles. They're isolated from others, people their age. And, when you're young, it's so important. I'm fairly isolated, but it's okay. I've had a life full of interactions. I mean, I can get lonely at times, but on the whole, I have a whole life to draw on. But when you're young, you need to be around other people to help form some sense of, what you might want to do in life, and what you like and what you don't like, and what passions develop and that kind of thing. And sometimes I get notes from parents who are so worried about their teenager or their child in their 20s who has no friends and is isolated at home, and because they're simply too sick to be able to go out. And then you think of all the repercussions from that. How are you going to find romance? And are you going to be able to have, and if you do, should you have children? And so there's a lot that they face that I hadn't paid attention to until people started to write to me about it.
Yeah, it was interesting in reading the book that this chapter is the one that stood out to me most, because you described so very well, even not having been through it yourself. I have, having been sickly from grade school on. And the things that you say here resonated very deeply. In particular, and you even just made reference to that, this being isolated from others your age, and how difficult that is, and how that is the experience when you do have a chronic illness that you're supposedly too young to have, and yet you do, and how that changes things for you. And so I'm very grateful to you for expressing that, and for opening up a little bit of spaciousness around understanding, compassion, and that there are others who have this same difficulty as well. So thank you for putting this in your book.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm really glad to get that feedback on the chapter.
And also, I wanted to note that if you're listening to this podcast and you're someone who does not suffer from chronic illness or pain, there's still something in here for you, because it is likely, and you may not even be aware of it, that there is probably someone in your life who is suffering in this way. And there are different sections in this book. Section 7 is around for family, friends, caregivers, and anyone concerned about chronic illness. And there are many chapters in there that are written for you to help raise your awareness. And Toni, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk just a little bit about that section and why that's in here. What's the value of putting that in the book? Why you wanted it in here?
Well, one reason I put that in the book is that I realized after I became chronically ill myself that how ignorant I was of what people's life was like. And we're talking about a huge segment of the population. I think there's some estimates of 50% of the population suffer from some kind of chronic pain or illness, and most of it is invisible, which is why people don't realize it. So, when you run into people on the street or in any situation, I can now recall sometimes in my work environment, I remember, I don't write about this, but I remember one of the staff members who was in IT, so she would help me with my computer, and one day we just got chatting, and she told me about this terrible pain condition she suffered from and how hard it was for her to come to work. But if she didn't come to work, she wouldn't be able to pay her rent. And she was afraid of becoming homeless. And I had no idea. And so one of the things I realized when I became ill was how much misunderstanding there is about what it's like to live day in and day out in pain or feeling sick. And that I myself was one of those people who didn't understand until it happened to me. And that's why I thought it was so important to write about. And so I write about the misconceptions about people who are chronically ill. And when I say chronic illness, I generally including chronic pain. Things like, if somebody looks good, they must feel good. If they were really sick, it would show. Also, this misconception that if there's something wrong with you, doctors can fix it. When I first got sick, I couldn't figure out. They tried everything on me, every antibiotic and every antiviral. And I thought, wait a minute, you get sick, you get better. But that's not necessarily the case. So I write about misconceptions, and then I have a couple of chapters. Both chapters are aimed at trying to help people learn how to talk to friends and family who suffer from chronic illness. So one chapter is about what not to say, and then there's a chapter on what to say, because that's another thing that people write to me about all the time is they don't know how to field insensitive comments. They don't know what to say when people say to them, "You look fantastic," that kind of thing, And I've had this happen to me. I'm barely able to stand up. It would be much better if someone said, "You look great. How do you really feel?" Just that little difference, that slight change it's the recognition. People, we all want to be recognized, to have our situation validated. And so some of the things in the chapter on what not to say are things that people reported to me. The first section are what people have said to me, and the second section is what people wrote to me about other people saying. And some of it is pretty outrageous. Just put down that cane and climb those stairs, that kind of thing. So the purpose of this chapter is not to these two chapters is not to complain. I think that the vast majority of people have the best of intentions. It's just that this culture does a very poor job of teaching us about the inevitability of health difficulties and the fact that you never know what condition a person is really in unless you ask. And one reason that we're ignorant about this is because of the barrage we get on the media that says, oh, if you just eat right and exercise, everyone can be healthy and everyone can live to 100. And that gets internalized. And so people really, they don't understand what life is really like for others. And so the purpose of this section is to help people understand and to give them some tools for helping out those who they care for who are suffering from chronic illness.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the cultural aspects of this, that there's so much shaming and pressure on the individual who is suffering. And it maybe isn't as simple as just making a decision to set down your cane and you'll be fine if only you decide to do it. That would be wonderful if we could just make that choice. And there's no one who is more interested in having that happen than someone who is chronically ill. So just the complexities of what it's like being embodied make it not always so that the experience for others might not be yours. I think of this when I look out and there are people who they're exercising, they're running. And some of the runners are very young, skinny, fit, perfect-bodied people. And maybe they are also having difficulty running. And there are others who are older and not in as good a shape, and it may be harder for. And you spoke to that very well in your section on invisibility, where we're talking about how you may look fine, but that's not necessarily what's happening. I also wanted to digress for just a moment on your chapters on what not to say and what to say, and add on to that one of the important things in talking with someone who is suffering in this way, or really in any way, is when you ask that question, how are you really doing? You may look great, but how are you really doing? Is to truly listen, to be truly, sincerely open, and just hear the other without having to try to fix things, and just listen.
Right. Yeah, that's what a lot of people who are suffering want. They just want to be listened to. And, I see a universality in a lot of what I write about that goes beyond chronic illness in a way. I can think of chronic illness as a metaphor for all the difficulties that people face in life. So in the same way that when you run into someone and I say you don't really know, they may be in pain, but you don't see it, well, they may be in mental pain too. It could even just be something temporary where a loved one has died, or a loved one has left them, or they've lost their job, you raised invisibility. Well, most of our troubles are invisible to others. And so it's good to remember whenever you're talking to someone that you don't know what's really going on in their life. And I agree with you that trying to remind yourself to just listen makes such a difference. There's the chapter on what to say, but one of the things I say in that chapter is, I don't care if you pick exactly the right words. I can read your intention. It's the intention that matters. It's the intention to show care. It's the intention to be willing to listen. So I'm not trying to say that, I'm not shaking a finger at people and saying, don't say this, do say that. I'm saying, think before you speak. And that if your intention is good, it doesn't matter if your words are perfect. And in a way, I'm also trying to tell that, I am trying to also tell that to others who are chronically ill, because sometimes we can get judgmental, like, how could he say that to me? Without realizing that his intentions were good, he just didn't have the skills to say it right.
Yeah, it's interesting opening up that spaciousness on both sides, that we acknowledge we're not perfect when we make the attempt to communicate in the same way that an individual who's suffering isn't perfect and healthy and well all the time.
Right. So I'm really in that section hoping that both those who are ill and those who care about them learn to be open-minded and forgiving of each other. And doesn't mean you don't want to try to educate and inform people about how you're doing, but to also recognize that they may love you dearly or care about you, but not have ever developed the skills to speak correctly or act correctly. You know, it depends on their life history and their conditioning.
Yeah, something you mentioned a couple of minutes ago struck a chord, and this is the underlying theme of the book, and it's one that's so important, and why this book isn't just for situations of chronic pain and illness. It's for living, because we all run into times where things aren't going right. And that's why so much of this book, taken in a way that doesn't directly relate to physical illness and pain, but just our human experience and the suffering that's involved with that, opens this up to every aspect of human life. And one of the things, Toni, I wanted to look at is how this is also a very practical book. And I randomly chose chapter 14, When the Blues Come Calling.
Yeah, when the blues come calling.
And you have a number of very specific things that you talk about in here in situations that, remember that the blues, like all moods and emotions, are impermanent and things like that. And I was wondering, what were some of the things, just writing the overall book, that stood out for you in putting it together as some of the gems that you were able to share in the book?
Well, first, I would just wanted to say about when you mentioned this particular chapter that when I write, it's important to me that I always offer the reader some practical advice, because I don't see the value in a book that simply says, and this is wrong with how you treat me, and this is wrong with my life, and this is the way I'm miserable. And there's a chapter, for example, on longing for our pre-illness life. And I certainly get that longing, but I want to always take that next step, which is, and what might we be able to do about that to alleviate our suffering over it and to make our life better? So I'm always looking for offering ideas for what people can do. And when you say what stands out to me, what stands out for me is always my go-to practice is self-compassion. And I'm sure I have to look at the chapter. I'm sure it's somewhere in the blues chapter. Well, yeah, there it is. Treat the blues with friendliness and compassion, because life can be really hard. Yes, it has its joys, but it's sometimes it's the difficult uphill climb. And the least we can do is treat ourselves with the same kindness and compassion that we would treat other people who we hold most dear. And I say that that's a good test of whether you're treating yourself well. Is this how you would treat someone who you loved? And so would you nag them to get out of bed if they're too sick to get out of bed? No. So don't nag yourself. So you'll see that as a thread throughout every chapter, because this is true in my life. When I get stuck, I go to self-compassion. And I even suggest people craft particular phrases that speak to the very difficulty they're facing. It's so hard to have to miss that party that I want to go to so badly. The more you can be specific about it and speak to yourself with the same loving kindness that you would speak to your child who had to miss a party. That in itself alleviates so much suffering and allows you to accept the life you have. And it's that acceptance, coming to peace with the life you have. Well, for me, that's the path to peace and contentment in life. I'm not always there, but I know it's the path.
Thank you, Toni. And I'm wondering, as we wrap up today, if there's anything else you'd like to share with the listeners or that you hope readers get out of the book.
Well, the only other thing I would share at this point, I'm thinking if I hadn't talked about compassion, self-compassion, I would be talking about that right now. But I would also say be patient with yourself and be patient with others. Because, as I said, other people, their intention, when I first got sick, I was angry at many of my friends, either because they didn't come around enough or they didn't come around at all, they didn't call me all the time, or if they did call, they said the wrong things. And that anger, it just turns around and slaps me in the face. It makes me feel worse. And what I came to realize was that their intentions were good. They just didn't have the skills, and they had problems of their own. Their life doesn't revolve around me. And so one of the ways that I came to understand this was by being patient, meaning taking a deep breath and reflecting on, am I sure that this is the way things are? And just having the patience to step back and question assumptions you're making that may be wrong about other people, and criticism that you may be directing at yourself. Just taking that deep, mindful breath and looking at things fresh again and with forgiveness.
Wonderful guiding ideas, Toni. Thank you for sharing that. For those of you who are listening to the podcast, you can find out more about Toni's work on her website, ToniBernhard.com. Our guest today, Toni Bernhard, thank you for being here. Wonderful speaking with you again.
I've really enjoyed it, Ted. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.